So we're going to look at the integument and parts of it, the epidermis, the layers of the epidermis, and the different cells involved. The dermis, which is the underlying connective tissue of the epidermis. The hypodermis, or as we'll call it here, the subcutaneous layer, so the layer between the dermis and the muscle and fascia and other tissues below. And then some special features that we're going to look at of the integumentary system, so things like pigmentation, paw pads, planum nasal, ergots and chestnuts and horses, and cutaneous pouches and sheep. So starting off, the integumentary system right here is the skin and all the related structures. So skin, hair, the different glands, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, all working together to do the following things. They do cover and protect the body, so they cover it from the outside environment and protect it from physical trauma, just walking around, moving in the environment, but also things that are like bacteria and other microbes that help to keep them from penetrating into the body, ultraviolet light and different noxious chemicals in the environment that would be dangerous to the body and the cells. It keeps those out. Prevents desiccation, so it keeps the body from drying out way too fast, so it helps to keep moisture in. Definitely reduces the threat of injury from just moving through the outside environment. That could be like where we have hooves or paw pads or the bottom of your feet, walking across the ground. And so it definitely reduces injury to the body with that. It also reduces it from like moving up against vegetation or other animals. It is one of the key organs in maintaining normal body temperature for mammals and avian, is the skin. It excretes excessive amount of water, salt, and organic waste through sweat. It is very key for receiving and sending on sensory information of the environment. That can be things like temperature, touch, pressure. All of those different things can be conveyed through the integumentary system. It's very important in the presence of sunlight to make vitamin D, and then it stores nutrients mostly in the sub-Q area in the forms of lipids and fat-soluble vitamins. So when we look at the integumentary system, we're going to have three layers. Out here on the surface, we're going to have the epidermis, and the epidermis is going to be about, on average, somewhere about 20 cells thick on the skin. And so we're going to have the outer portion of the epidermis we see, and then going all the way down here to the basement membrane. And this is all epithelial cells. So epidermis is epithelial cells. And then some of the epidermis actually goes down where we have the hair follicles and stuff will actually go down here into the dermis and grow down. So even things like your hair shaft and hair follicles are actually part of the epidermis. The dermis, known as corium, this is actually thick connective tissues. There's nerves that are going to run through here. We have things like the erector pili muscle, nerves like the Mesenter's corpuscles. We have things like the Pacinian corpuscles down here that are on the edge of the sub-Q space in the dermis. And of course, all these blood vessels and the dense irregular connective tissue. And then finally, we get down here to the hypodermis, or which we'll call the subcutaneous layer. This has got elastic connective tissue that lets the skin actually move around, and then it's filled with arteries and veins and different blood vessels in there and adipose tissues. So when we look at the cells of the epidermis, the major cell type is the keratinocyte. So this cell produces keratin, which gives the skin the rigidity and elasticity that it has on the surface. And it gives it a great amount of strength, and is actually what helps to keep desiccation away because of the keratin that's packed in there. It helps to keep moisture in the body and keep it from evaporating out. You have the melanocyte, which actually produces melanin pigment, and melanin pigment is very important in determining skin color, hair coat color. We have Langerhans cells, and these are actually specialized white blood cells that phagocytize invaders like bacteria and viruses and fungi. And then we have Merkel cells, and these are specialized cells that live in the epithelium that actually attach to nerves in the central or in the peripheral nervous system. And they actually give sensory information back as far as things can be like temperature and touch. So when we look at the epidermis, there's 5 distinct layers that we see. We see this especially in thick skin, and this is how we describe it. And each one of these cells is going through a special phase. And so the first one is what we know as the stratum corneum, and so this is the horny layer. And it gets its name because when we first started looking at skin structures underneath the microscope, we were looking at horns. And so this outer layer of cells that are on the very surface we noticed in there, and we started calling it the horny layer. But this is really dense cells densely packed with keratin in them, and they're flat, and they're actually they lack a nucleus, so they're anuclear. They've actually lack a nucleus now. Pretty much the cells have actually gone through something called apoptosis, where they've died. They've lost their mitochondria, all their organelles, and they're just pretty much out here just packed very tightly with keratin to protect the body. Down below that we have a layer called the stratum lucidum. This is usually only 1 or 2 cell layers thick when we see it, and this is a clear layer. And so the keratin is in there, but it hasn't quite coalesced all the way like it does in the stratum corneum. But we've already gone through the stage where there is no nucleus, there is no organelles in there, and so it doesn't pick up stain very easily, and so it looks clear when we go to stain it and look at them. Next layer down is the stratum granulosum, so it's going to be here. It's about the middle between the basement membrane and the very outer layer on the surface of the corneum. And once again, this is usually just 2 or 3 cell layers thick when we see it. And we call it a granular appearance because this is where the cell is actually going through apoptosis. It's actually losing its nucleus, it's losing all of its different organelles on the inside, and so there's this granular appearance when we're in this area from that happening. Next layer down before we get to the basement membrane where they start from is the stratum spinosum, and we call this the spinosum because it always looks like there's like a spiny layer right there to the cells, that the cells are starting to get a spiny appearance to them, as we say, and that's because this is where they're actually making keratin, and keratin production actually starts to change the cell membrane and the way the cell looks. Lastly, we get to the stratum basal. It's also known as the stratum germinativum. Basically, it's the basement membrane. It's that very bottom layer of cells. This is actually where the cells divide from. This is the meiotic area. And so you have this constant production with stem cells down here. They're constantly producing the daughter cells. They're going to move out here and mature and turn into the stratum corneum eventually in the mature keratinocyte packed with keratin. When we go to what we call hairy skin or thin skin, we can see 3 distinct epidermal layers. Now, all the things that we see happening at these different layers here, like we always have those basal cells, and we can always see that basal membrane. We can always see the stratum spinosum because in the spinosum here, they're starting to get spiculated because we're making keratin. And then we always see the corneum, the horny layer. What happens is that when we're looking at distinct layers, is sometimes we can lose the distinct layers of the lucidum and granulosum. These cells still exist, but most of the time they're going to be somewhere interspersed in the spinosum and the corneum layer, and we can't see them as a distinctive layer going across, meaning that there's a whole bunch of those cells that are packed together. Instead, there's the occasional ones that we see in the spinosum and the corneum. And so in our thinner skin, we can see 3 distinct epidermal layers instead of all 5. And so we're always going to see the basal, the spinosum, and the corneum. We have a lot of skin-like folds on the surface of the skin when we start looking at hairy skin. This folding is there because of the hair follicles and the hair coming out of place. And then we have certain little areas that we call tactile elevation. So this is where we have what we call epidermal papillae, where we actually have tactile hairs, or hairs that are used in sense and touch and sensation actually growing up from those layers. Next we get to the dermis. The greatest portion of the integument actually ends up being the dermis, otherwise known as the hide. It's actually what would make up leather. It's highly fibrous. It's packed with dense irregular connective tissue in there, so it's really, really thick and tough, and it needs to be that way to, number one, hold those epithelial cells of the epidermis on. But the other thing is it's once again that protection of the environment. Having that extra thick is there in case the animal comes up against like a sticker that it moves up across, to where it doesn't penetrate all the way into the body very easily. Or if a predator is trying to get, an animal, it makes it much harder for teeth or nails or claws to actually penetrate. And so it's made up of a lot of collagen in there. There's a little bit of elastin fibers, but it's mostly reticular and collagen fibers and our dense irregular connective tissue. Down in here, we're going to have ingrowths of the epidermis down in there to make up our hair follicles. We're going to have things like nerve endings in the form of the Meissner's corpuscles. Different glands, so you're going to have sebaceous glands that will be in this area, and eocrine sweat glands, and apocrine sweat glands, smooth muscle for the erector pili muscles, huge on blood vessels and nerves and lymphatics in there. Primary cells living in this area is going to be fibrocytes. There's not adipocytes in mammals, but there are adipocytes in avians. So when we're looking at avians do have adipocytes that will live within the dermis. And then macrophages, those Langerhans cells, are usually up in the epidermis, but they can actually start off and they have to migrate across there, and so some of them will be living there. And then there's other cells like your mast cells and monocytes, and that will live in the tissue. When we look at it, we have two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So the papillary layer ends up being very thin, and it's actually, when we look at the dermis, it actually has this folding up and down. So there's like peaks and valleys that grow up into the epidermis, and then the epidermis grows back down the dermis. And by having this, you can almost think of this as Velcro. And what it does is this is a way to actually help keep the epidermis to stay on the dermis. If we didn't have this folding, it would be very easy for the epidermis to just slide off or to be pulled off. But this way right here, with these papillae, it actually has grip and actually holds on the epidermis at the surface. There's a lot of blood vessels and nerve endings in this. This is where our Meissner's corpuscles are at. Actually, when we're looking at between the papillary and the reticular layers, it's very hard to see a clearly defined line. But if we're looking at a microscope slide where we have the folding up and down here, this is going to be our papillary layer. So it would come along a line like this, and it's less than 20% of the dermis. The majority of the dermis is going to be down here in the reticular layer, which makes up 80% or more of the dermis. And so this is an area where we have just a lot of collagen fibers, a lot of dense irregular connective tissues, blood vessels running through, axons and nerves running through. We do get things on here called dermal folds or flexure lines, and so these can be really important as far as letting skin to move, especially over motion areas like the elbow and different joints like that. Last layer is the hypodermis. This can be a thick layer also. It resides below the dermis. It's the area that allows skin to move freely over underlying structure, and it's made up of loose areolar connective tissue, and then we actually have a lot of elastic connective tissue in there too. And it's filled with adipose cells, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves in there. Right here at the junction between the subcu and the dermis is where we're going to have those Pacinian corpuscles located at. So we'll get to some of our special features we're going to look at here in the foot. And so we're going to start off with, looking at things like pigmentation and the melanocytes. So how we get coat and skin colors, paw pads, and some of the special parts about those in dogs and cats. The planum nasal, so on the face and on the nose of dogs and cats and cattle, and then ergots and chestnuts in the horse, and lastly cutaneous pouches in a sheep. So pigmentation is the result of presence or absence of melanin granules in the extensions of the melanocytes. So depending on how a melanocyte actually disperses and what it does with the melanin it produces is going to determine skin color and hair coat color. So if the pigmentation granules are near the nucleus and are not dispersed throughout the melanocyte and are not actually put out into the surrounding tissue, then the skin is going to appear more pink in color and the hairs are going to appear more white. If the pigmentation granules are out in the cellular arms and been put into the surrounding tissues, then we're going to get the black skin, and then we can get the hair coat colors of, depending on the type of melanin and the way it's dispersed, you can get red, you can get brown, you can get black, you can get yellow. And so it's important to understand that the melanocyte is what actually determines pigmentation color of the skin and also of the hair. The lighter and whiter it is, the more the melanin granules are clear in the nucleus. The darker the hair coat and the more it's dispersed, then the more those granules leave from the nucleus and actually go throughout the granulocyte and can actually be dispersed in the tissue surrounding. So melanocyte stimulating hormone is going to be secreted by the hypophysis, which is a part of the brain, the pituitary center. It does play a role in regulating melanin production in melanocytes in mammals and avian, but it plays a much, much larger role in reptiles and amphibians, where it can actually be responsible for things like changing the color of like a chameleon. That is actually controlled by MSH. And then a lot of the melanosomes can actually be absorbed by the keratinocytes as they go out, and it's very important for them as far as kind of keeping up that coloring of the pigmentation of the skin. Paw pads, these are a much thicker layer on the bottom of dog and cat feet. Also, other carnivores and omnivores like bears will actually have paw pads too. Very thick, tough layers. They have a fat pad underneath them, a lot of connective tissue in there. They actually have exocrine sweat glands, just like we have on our skin, so this is actually where we get a lot of the more moist sweat at, and temperature regulation in dogs and cats. And then they have these little areas called laminar corpuscles in there too, that will be down in the foot. Covering the entire pad is going to be conical papillae, and so these are actually kind of raised up from the bottom, and these are actually areas of dermis and epidermis that actually grow up and out, and they end up giving grip and traction for movement on the ground, and then also on getting food. So if we start looking at things like a bear or a dog or a cat, if they're trying to get prey, this actually gives them grip to hold on to prey or the food that they're going for. We see all 5 epidermal layers here. They are pigmented. And then we do have different pads. So we have the carpal pad, which is the most proximal pad. A lot of times this is not a weight-bearing pad, and it's not nearly as thick. The main weight-bearing pad ends up being the metacarpal pad, which bears somewhere around 80% of the body weight is on this, and it's in the center underneath the metacarpal bones. And then we'll have the digital pads, and the digital pads bear about 20% of the body weight, and these are actually right on the end of the digits there. Planum nasal, so this is actually on the nose, and usually this is just 3 layers thick. It can be sometimes thicker in some species to have all 5 layers, but in dogs and cats we're just going to see the 3 layers. It's got polygonal plaques and grooves on them. We know in dogs this actually helps in recovering scent for them. It can also give surface area for cooling. It's pigmented, so it can be black or it can be pink. There can be some variation depending on coat color and hair. In dogs and cats it's agranular, and also in horses, so aglandular. When we get to livestock like sheep, pigs, and cows, though, they do have some glands there that can secrete onto the surface. And then when we start looking at the, once again on the layers right there, we usually have 3 layers is usually what we see visible on it in the dog. Some other species we can see more. Ergots and chestnuts, these are on horses, so this is a dark horny structure. It's actually a remnant from where they had 3 toes at one time, so these would eventually have been toes millions of years ago in their evolutionary development. When we look at chestnuts, chestnuts are always going to be on the medial carpus and medial tarsal areas. That's where we're going to find those. And ergots are going to be in the palmar and plantar hairs at the back of the fetlocks. A lot of times we'll have owners that are not used to or are new to owning a horse and they've never seen these. They can think that they're wounds, or they can think that there's an issue with their horse when there's not. Lastly, we get to cutaneous pouches. So these are infolding of skin. They're between the toes, in the inguinal area, and below the eyes. And they produce an extra amount of oil called lanolin. And this lanolin ends up being very important for sheep for a couple of reasons. First off, sheep come from a much more colder environment, so it's important for them as far as maintaining body heat. But also, when we get to talking about hairs, it's the type of hair they have, which is a wool-type fiber. And this lanolin is very important in actually keeping the wool-type fibers very healthy and working and knitting together to conserve body heat.